Look at her, clutching that map. She actually thinks she can take it. Not a chance! Get lost!
Mara Wren Caldwell signed the estate papers with her gloves folded damp in her lap and a line of melted snow darkening the cuff of her gray coat. The conference room at Bell and Harrow smelled of toner radiator dust and the weak coffee no one had touched. Through the window, Briar Notch looked rinsed in late February light, every roof edge crusted with ice, every maple branch holding still as wire. Her brothers sat across from her in clean work jackets, Owen with his phone face up beside the legal pad, Grant turning his wedding ring with his thumb whenever the lawyer read a number aloud. The farmhouse went to them. So did the barn, the equipment shed, the road frontage, and the clean upper pasture a developer had already asked about. Mara received what the inventory called Parcel C, a ruined maple sugar house, one narrow strip of wooded sugar bush, and the lower access lane that crossed a frozen creek before disappearing under hemlocks. The lawyer, Mr. Harrow, cleared his throat before he said the assessed value. $900. Grant looked down. Owen did not. It's not nothing, Owen said as if he were leaving a tip. Dad wanted you to have something of your own. Mara looked at the copied survey map. Parcel C had been outlined in yellow highlighter too bright for the thin, wet paper. The shape of it was awkward, a crooked ribbon of land pressed between the farmhouse acreage and the county drainage ditch. Near the creek, someone had drawn a small rectangle and labeled it Sugarhouse, poor condition. Poor condition was generous. Mara had driven past the building every winter of her life and watched it lean farther into the slope. The cupola had lost 3 louvers. The metal roof had peeled up at one corner. Sap buckets hung from nails inside like dull mouths. Her father had once said the arch was still good, then never said why that mattered. She signed where Mr. Harrow pointed. Her checking account held $312. The funeral home still expected $2,740. She worked mornings at the bakery, washing mixing bowls and shaping rolls before dawn and afternoons, wherever someone needed a shift covered. Grief had made her slow. Debt had made her agreeable. By the time Owen slid a second document toward her about future access negotiations, her hand was already numb around the pen. Not that one, said May Dolan from the doorway. No one had heard the town clerk come in. She was a compact woman in a green wool hat with snow clinging to the hem of her black coat and a canvas record bag hooked over one elbow. She did not raise her voice. She only set the bag on the table hard enough to make Owen's phone jump. Mr. Harrow frowned. May, this is a family matter. Then, let the family finish the estate transfer before they start bargaining away road rights. May looked at Mara, not at the brothers. Take the parcel home first. Walk it in daylight. Don't sign anything else today. Owen laughed once through his nose. It's a collapsing shack. May's eyes did not move from Mara's face. Then it can wait one night. Mara folded the unsigned access paper and put it in her satchel. Her brothers said her name in 2 different tones, one tired, one warning. She stood anyway. The room swayed a little when she buttoned her coat. Outside, the cold tightened around her ribs. She drove away from the lawyer's office with the survey map on the passenger seat and her father's house visible above the village, white and square, and no longer hers. Smoke rose from its chimney. Someone had already parked Grant's truck by the barn. She did not go up the hill. The lower lane began where the town plow stopped. Mara left her aging Subaru beside a leaning mailbox and walked the rest, the snow crust breaking under her brown work boots. Her canvas satchel knocked against her hip. Bare maples climbed the slope on either side. Their trunks striped with old tap scars healed over like closed eyes. A few rusted buckets still hung from hooks tilted and full of ice. The sugar house appeared slowly, not as a building, but as a darker failure among trees. Its south sliding door had come off the lower track. One corner rested in the snow. The fieldstone foundation showed through where boards had rotted away and a split in the corrugated roof let a blade of late light fall inside. The cupola sat crooked on the ridge, its broken louvers pointed toward the gray sky. Beside the wall, the old stovewood rack had collapsed into a ribcage of wet sticks. Mara stood at the threshold until her breath thinned. She remembered being 7, maybe 8, standing outside this same door while her father spoke to someone inside. She had not been allowed past the sill. There had been steam, then real steam, rolling out warm and sweet enough to taste. Her father had lifted her onto a stump and handed her a paper cup of syrup diluted with snow. "Drink it slow, Wren," he had said. "Maple makes you wait." Now the place smelled of iron mouse droppings, wet hemlock, and old ash. She pulled the door just wide enough to slip through. The runner screamed. Snow fell from the top rail onto her shoulder. Inside the sugar house held a dusk of its own. The evaporator sat in the center on its brick arch, long and black, the pan rusted dry beneath a scatter of curled leaves. To the west ran the narrow firing aisle where split wood would once have fed the firebox. To the east was the boiling side with a warped plank floor and a row of hooks for skimmers and thermometers long gone. At the rear, the galvanized sap tank leaned on its platform, one leg sunk through the boards. Beyond it, a dark opening led to the north lean-to. Water ticked somewhere. Mara took one step, then another, testing each board before trusting it. Caleb Pike from the preservation crew had not inspected anything yet. She knew enough not to pretend Rot cared about inheritance papers. Near the arch, a strip of ice had formed where meltwater fell through the roof hole and froze again along the brick. The firebox door hung open. Its iron mouth was packed with cold ash. She crouched and held her bare fingers near it. Nothing. Her father's initials were cut into a hemlock post beside the firing aisle. J.C. low and uneven, as if carved by a boy. Mara touched the letters with the back of her knuckle. For a moment, she hated him for leaving the clean house to the sons who had already had houses and this cold wreck to the daughter who could not afford new tires. Then the water ticked again, not from the roof, lower. She turned her head. A thin white thread lifted from the evaporator pan. Mara stayed crouched, one hand on the post. The thread vanished, then returned curling from the seam where the rusted pan met the brick arch. It was slight enough that she first thought it was her own breath crossing the iron. She held her breath until her chest hurt. The steam rose again. No fire burned. No warmth came from the arch. The ashes inside the open firebox were gray and stiff with cold. She reached toward the pan and stopped before touching it, listening to the hollow tick of water under metal. The small, settling noises of a building waiting out winter. Outside, a truck moved somewhere up on the county road and faded. Inside, the sugar house went still. Mara pulled a matchbook from her satchel. The matches were from the funeral home, pale blue with silver lettering. She struck one against the flap. It flared sulfur-sharp in the damp air, and she held it near the firebox opening. The flame leaned inward. She moved it away. It straightened. Near the seam of the evaporator, it bent again as if the cold iron were breathing. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. The match burned close to her fingers. Mara shook it out and stood too quickly, her boot slipping on the icy strip. She caught herself against the hemlock post shoulder, striking the carved initials. The thread of steam grew thicker for one breath, white against the black pan, then thinned until it was almost nothing. Arch was still good. May had told her not to sign anything else. Owen had called it a collapsing shack. Mara took one unlit match from the book and held it between both hands, not to strike it, only to keep from dropping it. The match trembled anyway. Mara left the matchbook on the edge of the evaporator and backed toward the door without turning her shoulders from the arch. Outside, the air felt simpler. Snow rode salt wood smoke from the farmhouse chimney up the hill. Ordinary cold. She stood in it until her breath stopped racing, then slid the sugar house door shut as far as the warped rail allowed. The gap left at the bottom was wide enough for a fox. She packed loose snow against it with her boot, knowing it solved nothing, needing one small thing closed. The unsigned access agreement was still in her satchel. At home. If the room she rented above the bakery could be called home. Mara spread the survey map across her narrow bed and weighted the corners with a mug, a library book, a roll of masking tape, and her father's old folding knife. Parcel C looked even stranger under lamplight. The yellow line followed the creek, bent around a stand of maples, climbed to the sugar house, then narrowed into the lower lane like a handle. She traced the lane with one finger. If Owen and Grant wanted that road, it was not because the Sugarhouse was worthless. The next morning, she woke before the bakery alarm pulled on the same faded jeans and tied her brown work boots while the pipes clicked in the wall. Flour dust clung to the sleeve of her gray wool coat from yesterday's shift. She brushed it off, failed, and left it there. By 9, Caleb Pike was standing beside the leaning mailbox with a hard hat under one arm and a thermos steaming in his other hand. He was 28, narrow-faced with a carpenter's pencil tucked behind his ear and a habit of looking at buildings before people. His truck had a rack of lumber and a magnetic sign that read, Pike Preservation Carpentry, though the passenger door was a different color from the rest. "You Mara?" he asked. She nodded. "May called you." "May calls everybody." He looked down the unplowed lane. "She said you inherited a roof problem." "I inherited a family problem. The roof is separate." That earned half a smile, not enough to become friendliness. He handed her the thermos lid after pouring coffee into it. "Don't step where I don't step. If I tell you to back out, back out. Romantic buildings still kill people." "I'm not romantic about it." "No," Caleb said, watching the crooked cupola through the trees. "But you came back." They walked in single file, Caleb breaking the crust with careful steps. He stopped twice to look at the drainage, once to kneel beside the creek where ice had lifted a stone from the bank. Mara tried to see what he saw, the way meltwater had been finding the lowest path for years, the way the lower lane carried every spring thaw toward the Sugarhouse instead of away from it. "First repair isn't the pretty one," Caleb said. "What is it?" "Water. Always water." At the south door, he paused before touching anything. He photographed the track, the hinge strap, the gap under the sill, then eased the door open with both hands. The same damp iron smell came out. Mara looked first at the evaporator. No steam. Caleb noticed. "You expected something. I saw vapor here last night." "From a fire." "No fire." He turned his head toward her, then toward the arch. His expression did not sharpen into disbelief. It narrowed into procedure. "Show me where." Inside daylight made the damage less mysterious and more expensive. The roof hole over the west bay had soaked the firing aisle. One hemlock post showed punky wood at its base. The corrugated metal had peeled loose near the ridge, and the cupola let in powdery snow that had drifted across the pan. Broken buckets lay beneath the east wall. Their rims bent their hooks, still threaded with old wire. On a shelf by the sap tank, 3 glass hydrometers rested in a wooden case gone gray with mildew. Caleb moved slowly around the evaporator arch. He did not touch the pan at first. He looked into the open firebox, tapped the brick with the back of his knuckle, and held his bare wrist near the seam. "Cold," he said. "I know. Cold things can still move air. Chimneys draw. Voids breathe. Sun warms metal unevenly." He glanced up through the roof split. "But I'd want to know where the water's traveling before I called it harmless." Mara almost told him about the match flame leaning inward, then stopped. The detail felt too private, like handing over the one thing the place had said directly to her. Caleb set a strip of blue painter's tape on a hemlock post and wrote with his pencil, "Do not fire." Then below it, "Roof drainage arch inspection." "My father used to say the arch was still good," Mara said. "Your father worked here. When he was young, I think. His initials are there." Caleb crouched by the carved post and brushed dust from the letters JC with his thumb. He did not say anything soft about fathers. Mara was grateful for that. They found the rear SAP tank platform was worse than it looked. One leg had punched through the plank deck. Another leaned on a stone. Someone had jammed beneath it years ago. The galvanized tank itself was empty except for leaves, a dead hornet nest, and a skin of ice along the bottom seam. A cracked sap line entered through the north wall. Its end pointed not toward the tank, but toward the brick arch as if it had shifted over time. "That line shouldn't drip there," Caleb said. "Does it matter?" "It matters if meltwater is getting inside the arch." He stood and looked at the roof, the tank, the pan, the firebox. "Don't lift anything alone. Don't pry anything. Don't let your brothers bring anyone here with a crowbar and a sales contract." Mara gave a dry laugh. "That's specific." May was specific. At noon, May arrived carrying a canvas grocery bag and wearing the same green wool hat. She had parked at the road and walked slowly, planting each boot flat before trusting the snow. When Mara hurried to meet her, May waved her off. "I'm not glass," she said. "I'm only annoyed." She brought cheese sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, 2 apples, and an envelope of photocopied town records. They ate standing near the south door because Caleb would not let anyone sit on the old benches. May looked around the Sugarhouse with an expression Mara could not read. "You were here before?" Mara asked. "Not inside. Children weren't invited where boiling pans could skin an arm." May pressed her thumb along the fold of the wax paper. "But I remember carrying syrup cans to the school kitchen. Your grandmother's name was on them." "Elspeth." May nodded. "Elspeth Caldwell. People said she could stretch a gallon farther than a preacher could stretch a sermon." Mara waited for more, but May only took a small bite of sandwich. "What did she do?" Mara asked. "What needed doing?" May looked toward the evaporator. That was how people talked then when they didn't want charity named out loud. The word charity landed badly, though May had not aimed it at her. Mara looked away through the open door, up the lane, toward the farmhouse roof just visible between maples. Smoke rose from the chimney again. Grant's truck was gone. Owen's was still there. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. "Owen developer wants answer by Friday. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." A second message followed before she could put the phone away. "Owen, that lane affects all of us." Mara turned the screen face down against her palm. May saw. Caleb saw and pretended not to. By mid-afternoon, Caleb had marked 3 danger spots with tape and 1 with a scrap of orange flagging. The roof needed a tarp before the next thaw. The west sill needed bracing. The arch could not be fired until a mason looked at the brick. The cupola was crooked, but not the first priority, which disappointed Mara in a way she did not admit. She wanted the most visible broken thing fixed first. Caleb kept pointing to the places water entered quietly. "You stabilize from the cause, not the insult," he said. After they left, Mara stayed behind. She should have gone to the bakery room before dark. Instead, she carried a broom from the lean-to and swept a strip of floor near the south wall. Wet leaves moved in a black ribbon. Mouse droppings clicked against the dustpan. She worked until her shoulders warmed and the Sugarhouse changed by no more than 6 square feet. It was still something. From her satchel, she took a scrap of cardboard torn from a flower box and wrote Caleb's order in thick black marker. "Roof, water, arch," she added after a moment. The cardboard curled in the damp. She pinned it to the inside of the south door with a bent nail already in the wood. Then she stood back, listening. No steam rose from the evaporator. No hidden warmth answered her. Only the creak under its lid of ice ticking where the thaw had begun. Mara bought flour from the bakery at the employee discount and carried it to the Sugarhouse in a paper sack tucked under her coat. The morning had gone soft. Snow sagged from the maple limbs in heavy clumps, and the lower lane had turned slick where yesterday's footprints filled with meltwater and froze again in the shade. At the south door, her cardboard sign had bowed from damp but held its nail. Roof. Water. Arch. No more signing. The words looked less brave in daylight and more like instructions left by someone who expected her to obey. She set the flour on the east plank floor away from the worst leak and took out a flashlight, a stub of candle blue painter's tape, and her phone. Caleb had texted before breakfast. "Photograph first, touch second, pry never." So she photographed the evaporator from all 4 sides, the open firebox, the seam where the vapor had risen, the cracked sap line entering from the north wall, and the sagging rear tank platform. Then she crouched beside the brick arch and listened. The firebox was still cold. Its ash had a crust on top, gray as old paper. She held the back of her fingers near the open iron mouth, then near the pan seam. No heat, only the raw mineral chill of brick that had spent months drinking winter. Mara opened the flour sack and pinched a small amount between her fingers. She dusted it lightly near the firebox opening. The powder fell straight down. She moved to the seam where the pan rested on its front bracket and dusted again. This time the flour trembled. Not much, a faint pull almost too delicate to trust. It slid along the black iron lip and vanished through a hairline gap between rusted pan and brick. Mara leaned closer until the smell of cold ash and old syrup scale filled her nose. She dusted again. The powder drew inward as if the arch had taken a slow breath. She wrote it down in the Notes app because writing made fear behave. 9:42 a.m. No fire, flower pulls inward at front seam. The candle showed the same thing. Near the south door, the flame stood upright. Near the firebox mouth, it bent slightly toward the dark. Near the pan seam, it leaned hard enough for wax to spill over Mara's thumb. She hissed and shook her hand. The Sugarhouse answered with a hollow tick. She went still. Another tick followed. Then a thin drip, not from overhead, but from behind the sap tank platform. Mara stood and stepped around the evaporator, placing her boots on the joists Caleb had used. At the rear wall, the cracked sap line had begun to weep. Meltwater slid along its underside, gathered at the split, and dropped onto a slanted scrap of tin someone had nailed there years ago. From the tin, it ran impossibly neat toward the back of the brick arch. It was not magic. The thought came with relief first, then with a deeper unease. Someone had made the water travel that way, or at least allowed it to keep traveling after the line failed. Mara photographed the drip. She sent the picture to Caleb with one sentence. Water is entering behind the arch. He called before the message showed as read. Are you alone? Yes. Step away from the back wall. I'm not touching it. Good. Is the pan moving? She looked at the long, rusted evaporator pan. No. Is the arch bulged? Not that I can see. Can you see daylight through the roof hole hitting the tank platform? Yes. That could warm the tank metal before the bricks start a draft. Pull damp air through a void. It can make vapor if cold metal meets moist air. He paused. It can also mean there's a cavity where water has no business going. A cavity in the arch. Maybe behind it. Maybe under it. Maybe just rot and bad luck. Don't make it poetic yet. Mara looked at the flower streak disappearing into the seam. Too late. Caleb sighed, but not unkindly. I can be there in 40 minutes. Do not pry. She promised. For 38 minutes she did not pry. She swept the dry boards near the east wall, stacked 3 unbroken buckets mouth down on a bench, and carried a nest of wet cardboard out to the lean-to. Every few minutes she looked at the pan. Once a faint thread lifted from the seam and vanished before she could raise her phone. Caleb arrived with Ruthie Bell behind him. Ruthie was 19, with a red knit cap pulled low over blunt-cut hair and a milk crate of towels in both arms. She lived 2 farms down, worked at the feed store, and had the solemn confidence of someone trusted early, with chores that could break fingers. May sent towels, Ruthie said. She said old paper hates wet hands. We haven't found paper, Mara said. May said you would. Caleb heard that and closed his eyes for half a second. Nobody is finding anything until we know the arch won't drop a brick on us. He laid a moving blanket on the floor and set out a pry bar, but left it untouched. He checked the brick joints with a flashlight and tapped along the arch in a slow pattern. The sound changed near the rear from dense to hollow, then back again. Mara saw his face alter by 1 degree. What she asked? Maybe nothing. You hate that answer when I use it. I hate it now, too. He reached under the front lip of the evaporator pan, not lifting, only testing. Rust crackled. The pan shifted less than a quarter inch and stopped hard. Caleb stood back and examined the fittings. Old flat pan, front bracket here. Rear lugs likely seated into the brick. Draw off lever on the right. He pointed to a rusted handle Mara had assumed was frozen decoration. If that valve rod runs through it, may have been repaired, modified, or jammed against something. Something like a latch, Ruthie asked. Caleb looked at her. My uncle restores tractors, she said. People hide switches in dumb places. People hide switches in excellent places, Caleb said. Then other people call them dumb because they worked. He photographed the lever before touching it. Mara did the same. The handle resisted his first pull, then gave with a dry scrape that made all 3 of them step back. Nothing fell. No brick cracked. From inside the arch came a small metallic click. Mara felt it in her teeth. Caleb held up one hand to keep them still. With the other, he pressed lightly on the pan's front bracket. The bracket dropped the thickness of a coin. A seam appeared along the back wall of the firebox. Not a collapse, not damage, a line. Ruthie whispered, "Oh." Caleb's voice went flat with concentration. Mara, call out exactly what I do. Ruthie, write it down. Why, Mara asked. So later nobody has to pretend memory is evidence. He moved slowly. Draw off, lever lowered. Front bracket released. Pan not lifted yet. Firebox rear visible joint. Brick condition stable, pending inspection. Ruthie wrote every phrase on the back of a feed receipt, her mitten tucked under her arm. Caleb and Mara lifted the front edge of the pan together, only 2 inches enough for Russ to complain, and old scale to fall like black snow. The rear did not come free, but the narrow movement changed the pressure inside the arch. Damp air breathed out through the firebox, carrying the smell of wet stone and something darker sweetened by age. The false rear wall loosened at one corner. Caleb did not use the pry bar. He pressed the shifted brick with his thumb. It moved inward, then swung slightly to the left on a hidden iron pin. Behind it was not a room, not a treasure hollow, not anything large enough for a body or a chest or the kind of story Owen would have mocked. It was a dry, brick-lined pocket no deeper than Caleb's forearm, tucked above the rear heat mass where the old arch stayed protected from roof water. The inside had been blackened by years of firing, but the upper curve was clean enough to show deliberate work. Mara knelt because her legs had begun to shake. Inside the pocket, wrapped in oilcloth stiff with age, rested a flat packet bound with cotton twine. In front of it lay a small object half buried in ash. Caleb shone the flashlight but did not reach in. "Your property," he said. "Your call. But go slow." Mara pulled on the clean cotton gloves Ruthie handed her. They were too large and made her fingers clumsy. She lifted the small object first. It was a maple leaf cut from wood no bigger than a silver dollar. Its edges scorched dark. Someone had drilled a hole near the stem as if it once hung from a string. The front had been stamped with a single letter. E. No gold. No miracle. Just a blackened wooden token that had survived where it should have burned. Mara sat back on her heels. The Sugarhouse seemed to widen around her, the broken buckets, the leaning tank, the cold pan still propped on Caleb's block, the crooked cupola admitting a pale stripe of sky. She could hear the creak under the ice. She could hear Ruthie breathing through her mouth, trying not to ask the first question. She could hear Caleb's pencil moving as he labeled a photograph. Her phone buzzed on the floor beside the flour sack. Owen again. Mara did not touch the phone. She looked at the token in her palm, at the letter Y pressed into scorched maple at the hidden pocket that someone had made with care and trusted to heat, brick, and silence. The pan gave a faint tick as cooling metal settled. From the exposed seam one last thread of white vapor rose and crossed the beam of Caleb's flashlight before dissolving in the cold air. Mara carried the oilcloth packet to May Dolan's kitchen in a cake box from the bakery because it was the cleanest thing she owned with a lid. Caleb drove behind her all the way into town. Ruthie sat in Mara's passenger seat with the scorched maple token cupped between 2 folded towels, as if the small, blackened thing might wake if handled carelessly. No one talked much. The Sugarhouse had given them an answer shaped like a question, and each mile of thawing road seemed to make it heavier. May had cleared her kitchen table before they arrived. A vinyl cloth was rolled and set aside. In its place lay brown craft paper, 2 desk lamps, cotton gloves, pencils, a shallow tray, and 4 soup cans washed clean to hold curling pages flat. The room smelled of lemon oil, old heat, and the chicken broth May had forgotten on the stove. "Hands," she said. They washed, even Caleb. Mara opened the cake box with the care of someone disarming a machine. The oilcloth packet had darkened where damp had touched one edge, but the twine was intact. May did not let anyone untie it until she had photographed all sides, written the time on an index card, and placed the card in the frame. "People think records are true because they are old," May said, adjusting the lamp. "Records are true when you can show where they came from and how you kept them." The twine broke rather than untied. Inside was a ledger bound in cracked brown cloth, a stack of narrow slips tied with faded red thread, a smaller envelope marked "School," a folded legal paper, and one letter addressed in Mara's father's handwriting. Not to Owen, not to Grant. Mara Wren. She touched the envelope and stopped. Her name looked younger in his script than she felt. May opened the ledger first because it was the strongest object and the least private. The first page bore the name Elspeth Caldwell Maple Ledger, 1968. The columns had been drawn by hand, date, gallons, household, paid, carried, forgiven, work returned. The handwriting was compact and slanted, each entry made with the discipline of a person who expected numbers to defend kindness later. March 14, Pike family. 1 quart, paid 0, carried 0, forgiven spring fever 3 children. March 16, school kitchen, 2 gallons, paid flour credit, work returned boys stacked wood. March 19, Dolan Agnes, 1 penty, paid 0, forgiven baby coming. May's hand went to the edge of the table. Agnes was my mother, she said. No one moved. May leaned closer, not crying, not yet. I was born in April. Mara looked from the ink to May's face. The ledger had been asleep inside brick, while May spent decades stamping deeds, recording births, and telling other people where their property lines ended. All that time, her own beginning had been written here in syrup and restraint. The narrow slips were not bills. They were promises not collected. Some had names Mara recognized from mailboxes and road signs. Some had only first names and amounts measured in pints flour. Cordwood school lunches, rides to the doctor. Across many, Elspeth had written paid in full by spring work or forgiven before mud season. Ruthie read one silently, then pressed her lips together and set it down. My grandmother's maiden name is here, she said. May took off her glasses and wiped them with the hem of her sweater. Then we are not reading the slips aloud until families decide what belongs in public. That settled the room. It was not treasure because treasure could be counted without permission. This was different. It required manners. The envelope marked school held 9 notes, all from children or teachers thanking Mrs. Caldwell for syrup, bread mittens, or simply for not writing names on the jars. One note had a maple leaf drawn in pencil at the bottom. Beside it was the same letter stamped into Mara's token. E. Elspeth used these, Mara asked. May nodded slowly. Tokens, maybe. A quiet way to mark what came from here. Caleb turned the folded legal paper under the lamp but did not open it. This has a notary seal. May's town clerk face returned. Let me. The paper unfolded with a sigh. It was a deed addendum dated 1983, signed by Elspeth Caldwell, and later acknowledged by Jonah Caldwell. It clarified that the Lower Lane Creek crossing and Sugarbush access were pertinent to the Sugarhouse parcel and could not be transferred separately from it without the written consent of the Sugarhouse owner. Mara read the sentence 3 times. The room did not brighten. No music rose. Nothing in the paper paid the funeral bill or fixed the roof, but Owen's message from that morning changed shape in her memory. Need your signature tonight. May slid the addendum into a clear sleeve. Now we know why. Mara's stomach tightened. Did Dad know? May looked at the remaining envelope. Her father's handwriting waited. Mara wanted to leave it sealed. For one childish second, she wanted her father to remain only unfair because unfair was simpler than hidden and sorry. Then, Caleb shifted back from the table, giving her room without announcing it, and Ruthie turned toward the sink as if suddenly fascinated by a dripping faucet. Mara opened the letter with a butter knife May handed her. Wren, if this reaches you, I failed to say it plain. That was the first line. She had to set the page down and breathe before she could continue. Her father wrote that Elspeth had run the Sugarhouse through lean years when pride kept neighbors from asking for help and gossip punished those who did. She made syrup bread and accounts that protected people instead of exposing them. Jonah had helped as a boy. He had carved his initials low on the post because Elspeth told him no honest work was too small to sign. He wrote that Owen and Grant saw land as leverage because he had taught them to survive that way after their mother died. He did not excuse it. He did not ask Mara to forgive them. He wrote that he had been afraid if he explained the addendum before his death, the argument would begin while he was too sick to finish it. I left you the coldest-looking place because you were the only one who ever waited long enough to learn what was still warm. Mara pressed the heel of her hand to her mouth. The sentence hurt worse than an apology. It did not undo the hospital weeks when Owen came with spreadsheets and Grant came with silence. It did not pay what she owed. It did not give back the farmhouse room where her mother's quilt had hung. But it took the Sugarhouse out of the category of leftovers and placed it carefully into her hands. Her phone rang. Owen. The name lit the screen on May's table vibrating beside Elspeth's ledger. Mara let it ring until it stopped. A text followed. We're coming over. This has gone far enough. Grant sent one after that. Just sign the lane paper and keep the shack, please. May looked at Mara. You don't have to answer tonight. Yes, Mara said, surprising herself. I do. Owen and Grant arrived 15 minutes later, stamping slush from their boots in May's back entry as if they still had the right to enter any room Mara occupied. Owen saw the papers first. Grant saw Mara's face. What is all this? Owen asked. Records from the Sugarhouse, Mara said. Owen's jaw tightened. You went digging through unsafe property after I told you we had a deadline. Caleb stood at the edge of the kitchen, hands loose at his sides. The discovery was documented. The structure wasn't forced. I wasn't asking you, May said, but you should have been. Mara placed the clear-sleeved deed addendum on the table and turned it so Owen could read the underlined clause. His eyes moved once across the page, then back again more slowly. Grant took his cap off. It says the lane stays with Parcel C, Mara said. The road, the creek crossing the Sugarbush access. You can't sell it around me. Owen pushed the paper back. Dad never mentioned this. He mentioned it to me, Mara said, touching the letter but not handing it over. Too late. But he did. For a moment, she wanted to say everything. She wanted to read the line about leverage. She wanted Grant to hear the word survive and know their father had seen him clearly. She wanted Owen's face to change in front of May, Caleb, Ruthie, and every quiet name in Elspeth's ledger. Instead, she closed the letter. The private records stay private, she said. The deed goes to Mr. Harrow tomorrow. I'm not signing the lane paper. Owen stared at her as if she had spoken in someone else's voice. You can't afford that building. I know. You don't even know what you're doing. I know that too. Grant looked toward the ledger. His anger had never been as clean as Owen's. It had seams in it, Mara. That offer could help everybody. It could help you sell what Dad already separated. No one answered. Ledger, like late sun, threw us up. Mara rested her fingertips on the table beside it, not touching the documents, not hiding them either. Outside thaw water ran along the curb in the dark. Inside, the deed addendum lay under the syrup jar holding its place. May opened the feed store trailer before sunrise, so Caleb could take the roof tarp from the rack without bending it twice. The thaw had come hard overnight. Water ran under the snow crust in narrow silver paths, and every sound around the Sugarhouse seemed amplified by wet ground. Mara and Ruthie dragged the tarp up the lane, while Caleb carried the ladder, stepping where the packed snow still held. None of them spoke until the first edge of blue plastic snapped in the wind. Start, high, Caleb said. Pull it farther than looks necessary. Water ignores hope. Mara climbed only where he told her to. The roof hole over the west bay was wider than she had admitted to herself. From the ladder, she could see daylight through a second seam near the cupola, a weak line hidden from the ground. Caleb handed up wooden battens, roofing screws, and a coil of twine. Ruthie held the tarp taut while Mara and Caleb fastened it down over the worst opening, then folded the excess so meltwater would shed away from the arch instead of pooling above it. When they finished the first pass, water still moved, but it moved where they wanted. Caleb checked the gutter line with a stick and pointed at the low spot. This still needs a real repair, but for now, it's off the bricks. Mara stood under the tarp edge and listened to the rainwater sound inside the plastic. It was not the leak she feared most. It was the old, steady drip from the back wall, the one that had made the hidden pocket possible. Caleb traced that with chalk, then set a temporary trough from scrap flashing to carry it away from the arch. Ruthie looked up at the tarp flapping over the roof hole. It already seems less doomed. Don't say that out loud, Caleb said. Mara laughed once, tired and surprised by it. Then she saw that the laugh had not vanished the weight in her chest, only moved it enough for her to work. They cleared a dry corner in May's kitchen and turned the ledger into a project instead of a relic. May made the rules plain. Nothing private went public without consent. Anything with family names stayed folded and sleeved until people could be asked. Anything tied to school meals, common help, or property boundaries got indexed first. She wrote labels in a neat clerk's hand while Mara read entries aloud and Ruthie copied them onto index cards. The work changed the room by inches. Names became places. Places became habits. The same people appeared again and again. A cord of wood for Mrs. Pike. 2 loaves for the school syrup carried to the infirmary. A repaired boot. A ride home after the storm road closed. Elspeth's ledger was not a hidden fortune. It was a map of who had survived because somebody kept quiet and kept counting. Mara found one slip tucked behind the school notes. It recorded 3 gallons delivered to the cafeteria. The winter her mother was ill-marked, simply returned in full by spring work. Ruthie held the page so it would not curl. People owed each other more gently, then, Ruthie said. May nodded, and more honestly in some ways. They boxed the records in archival sleeves, not decorative ones. Caleb built a simple dry shelf from leftover pine off the floor and away from the wall. Mara placed the scorched maple token in a small envelope, then wrote E on the outside because that was the only label the token had earned so far. For the first time since the discovery, she could picture the Sugarhouse as a place where documents lived safely, not a place where secrets waited to be sold. Owen came to the Sugarhouse at noon with Grant behind him and the same clean boots he wore to town meetings. He stopped at the tarp, at the flashing trough, at Caleb's ladder, and at Mara standing in the doorway with the deed addendum in a clear sleeve. His jaw tightened before he said a word. Grant did not look at the building first. He looked at Mara. "You sent a clerk's notice?" Owen asked. "I sent the deed addendum to Mr. Harrow," Mara said. "He'll file it this afternoon." Owen's face flushed. "You think one old paper cancels a development offer? It cancels the lane sale. That lane is the only thing that gives this place value." May, who had come up behind Mara with her keyring in hand, answered before Mara could. "No. The lane is what makes the parcel whole. Learn the difference." Grant exhaled through his nose and stared at the tarp edge moving in the wind. "Dad should have said something." "He did," Mara said, "just not when you wanted." Owen tried to keep the argument in property terms because property terms gave him control. "You can't maintain it. I can maintain the parts that matter first. Then what you boil, syrup for neighbors, and call it a life." Mara looked at him, not heated, not pleading. "I call it work. Dad did too. Elspeth did better than that." The sentence landed. Owen had no answer for Elspeth because the records had made her too specific to dismiss. He saw that. Grant saw it too, and his shoulders sagged a little, though not from defeat, from recognition. Mara set the sleeve flat on the hood of Caleb's truck so Owen could read the clause again. "Any separate transfer of the access lane is void without the Sugarhouse owner's consent," she said. "That's me." Silence held for a beat, then 2. Owen's hands opened and closed once at his sides. "So what now?" Mara took the paper back. "Now you stop trying to buy the road from under me." No one shouted. That was the point. She had not come this far to turn the kitchen and Sugarhouse into a courtroom. Grant looked older in the daylight than he had in the lawyer's office. Owen looked exactly the same, which was worse. When they left, May did not watch them go. She was already locking the record box. The sill on the west wall gave way when Caleb pressed a probe into the rot, so he made everyone stop and look at the exact shape of the damage. Not all rot was dramatic. This one was quiet, a long, pale line where water had worked through the lower hemlock and softened the wood from the inside out. Caleb cut away only what had failed, then fit a temporary scarf brace under the remaining beam with Ruthie, holding the jack steady, and Mara reading the marks he made with pencil. "Do not force the jack," he said. "Let the building settle onto it." Mara repeated the instruction aloud as if speaking it would make her less likely to panic when the old wall moved a fraction. The structure answered with a low wooden creak and then held. Caleb nodded once, which in his language meant the worst was not happening. They replaced the first rotted section with treated lumber cut to match the original dimension, not because it was pretty, but because the arch and pan depended on the wall staying true. Mara brushed away sawdust as Caleb drilled pilot holes. Ruthie passed screws, gloves, and a flashlight without being asked twice. When the new sill sat square, Caleb slid a moisture barrier beneath the lower edge and sealed the seam with compatible compound, not foam, because foam trapped the wrong kind of trouble. By late afternoon, the Sugarhouse had stopped shedding water in the places that mattered. The tarp held. The trough ran clear. The sill no longer sagged enough to make the west wall look tired. Mara stepped back from the work and saw the building differently again. Not restored, not saved, just correctly braced, which was a kind of mercy. At the rear arch, the hidden pocket remained open under a cloth cover Caleb had rigged to keep dust out. The ledger box rested safely on May's dry shelf. The token sat in its envelope. Nothing here had become easy, but the place had stopped leaking into collapse. Ruthie wiped her hands on her jeans and looked up at the cupola. "It's less cold in here," answered with that thin, impossible steam. It waited instead, quiet and patient, with its first honest repairs in place. She set her palm against the repaired sill. The wood was still damp, still rough, still unfinished. It held. Caleb would not let anyone fire the arch until he had checked the brick one joint at a time. He came early with a flashlight, a masonry chisel, and a notebook full of measurements. Mara expected him to talk about restoration in broad terms. Instead, he worked like a doctor. He tapped, listened, marked, and measured. Where the brick sounded hollow, he flagged it. Where old mortar had powdered away, he scraped only enough to see the line beneath. He asked Ruthie to hold the light low so the shadow would show the true shape of the joints. "The arch is original," he said. "The patchwork isn't." Someone kept this place alive longer than the records admit. Mara stood at the firing aisle with her hands in her coat pockets. "Can it take heat?" "Not full heat yet, but yes, after we clean it right." They removed the loose ash from the firebox with a hand shovel and 2 flat trays, taking care not to disturb the hidden pocket wall farther back. The ash was cold enough to crumble like lake mud. Under it, the fire brick showed a pattern of repair, a few replacement bricks at the throat. One older crack sealed with a thin band of compatible mortar, and a smoke path that suggested decades of small fires rather than one hot, careless burn. Ruthie asked, "Why would somebody build a pocket behind the firebox and not write it down?" Caleb answered without looking up. "Because if you wrote it down, somebody might remove it." May had come by with tea and a box of labels. She listened from the doorway and nodded once. People hid practical things for practical reasons: taxes, nuisance, family arguments, school board politics. Mara almost smiled. "You make it sound mundane." "It was mundane," May said. "That's why it survived." They swept the firebox floor clean, vacuumed the crevices with a small shop vac fitted with a narrow nozzle, and set a moisture meter against the surrounding brick. Where the reading climbed too high, Caleb stopped and let the wall dry before sealing anything. He would not plaster over the hidden pocket opening. He framed it instead with reversible trim and a removable protective panel, the kind of work that acknowledged a secret without trapping it. By the time they finished, the arch looked less like a mystery and more like an old tool returned to use. Mara stood with the first split of dry kindling in her hand and felt her pulse catch against her throat. Not because she wanted spectacle, because the place had asked her to trust it, and she was still learning how. Caleb noticed and said, "We're not lighting a fire. We're testing draft with a candle, then heat with a narrow starter, only if the brick reads right." "That still sounds like a fire." "It's a controlled argument with physics." Ruthie snorted into her sleeve. The candle flame bent just slightly toward the throat of the arch. Not at the hidden pocket. Not toward the back seam. Toward the path that had once carried heat under the pan. It was enough to prove the structure had a living draft and enough to keep them cautious. Mara wrote the result on a card and taped it beside the door. "Draft active. No hot fire yet." The note made the place feel less haunted by uncertainty and more governed by method. The next day, Mara and Ruthie drove to the school kitchen with 2 sleeves of copied ledger pages and a box of jars Elspeth's name had once lived on. May had arranged the meeting quietly. No press, no town crowd, just the principal, the cafeteria manager. 1 retired cook and 3 women who had been children when syrup still came from the Caldwell Sugarhouse in milk cans. The room smelled of bleach and bread. Fluorescent lights flattened everyone's face until the ledger pages were spread across the table. The retired cook. Mrs. Venn touched one of the school notes with her fingertip. "Your grandmother left these with the jars and never made a fuss," she said. "Some weeks the syrup was all that made the oatmeal worth eating." Mara watched the room change under plain memory. Nobody was impressed. That was the mercy of it. The record did not need applause. It needed witnesses. Ma explained which parts of the ledger could be shared and which stayed sealed. The families named in public entries already knew their own histories or would recognize them if asked. The private debt slips stayed private. Mara made that boundary herself, and when the principal asked if the school could keep a framed copy of the lunch entries, Mara said yes. Ruthie helped to tape a small index to the inside sleeve of the copy packet. Not dramatic, useful. She had the practical instinct of somebody who learned early that care is often just good labeling. One by one, names softened, not erased, softer. The Caldwell Sugarhouse was no longer only a ruin on the lower lane. It was a place that had fed children-covered shortages and kept a quiet accounting of need. At the end of the meeting, Mrs. Venn handed Mara a folded note from the old-school kitchen staff. On the front, in faded blue ink, was written, "Return if opened." Inside was a recipe for maple cream and a line that made Mara look up. "Your grandmother said the house was never the whole story. The work was." Mara folded it back carefully. She felt the weight of that sentence more than any sentimental praise. The town hearing was smaller than Owen had hoped and larger than Grant expected. Mace sat at the clerk's table with the deed addendum under glass. Caleb had not come to argue. He came because the building needed a preservation report and because nobody trusted a paper trail that lacked a technician. Ruthie came as a witness to the cleanup and nothing more. Mara came in the same gray coat she had worn to the estate office, though now the cuff had a repaired seam where she had stitched it herself. The select board chair asked only what was necessary. Was the lane part of Parcel C? Yes. Was the addendum valid? Yes. Could the access road be sold separately? Num. Could the Sugarhouse be used as a seasonal educational and food support site? If it was stabilized, yes. Owen tried once to reframe the issue as lost opportunity. Grant did not help him. He had read the ledger copies and sat with his hands clasped, listening to the room without interrupting. That more than anger changed the shape of the hearing. Mara spoke last. "I'm not asking the town to rescue this place," she said. "I'm asking to keep what it was for. It fed people. It taught people. It stayed standing because someone kept returning to it. That's the work I'm willing to do." No one applauded. The chair simply marked the minutes and moved on. Outside, Owen caught up with her beside the steps. For once, he did not bring a salesman's voice. "Dad should have told us," he said. "Yes," Mara said. "I thought you'd understand the place." "I do." Owen looked toward the street, then back at her. "I still think you're making this harder than you need to." Mara adjusted the strap of her satchel. "You keep saying that like hard is the problem." He had nothing to answer. He let her pass. Grant lingered a moment longer. "If you need help with the wood hauling," he said, "I can come after work." It was not a peace offering and not an apology. It was a practical sentence which in this family was its own language. Mara nodded once. "Friday," she said, "if the weather holds." By the end of the week, the Sugarhouse had enough order to let the work become careful instead of urgent. Caleb and Mara rebuilt the west sill fully using treated lumber, where the old member had failed, and matching dimensions where the original framing still carried load. Ruthie stacked and labeled salvaged pieces. May documented the repairs for the town file, so no one could later pretend the building had been altered without oversight. Mara learned the rhythm of a chisel handle, the weight of a jack, the way a straight level can correct a lie in an old wall. Then came the first clean boil. Not the full season, not anything grand. Just a test batch with a few buckets of sap from the healthy maples above the lane, boiled slowly in the restored pan, while Caleb watched the brick and Mara watched the steam rise through the cupola. The fire was small and even. The draft held. Water no longer leaked into the arch. The pan gave off a low, steady sound that was almost comforting because it was so ordinary. Ruthie stood by the door and laughed once when the first real sweetness hit the air. May breathed in and closed her eyes. "That's the smell," she said. "That's the one I remember." The vapor curled up through the repaired louvers and out into the afternoon white against the dark trees. For the first time, it did not seem impossible. It seemed earned. Mara lifted the skimmer and watched the syrup change color in the pan from pale to amber to something deeper and slower. The process would take the rest of the day. It always would. That was the point. Nothing here happened all at once. The place had been built for patience, and patience had been the hidden mechanism all along. Spring arrived with mud on the lane and sap in the buckets. The Sugarhouse stayed open, not as a tourist piece, not as a rescue story, but as a working place with rules and limits. Mara kept the ledger copies in the dry shelf. The private slip stayed sealed. The deed addendum remained filed. The access lane stayed hers, not as a trophy, but as a responsibility. She signed no sale papers. The first full boil came on a clear morning, when the maples shone wet and black in the sun. Mara lit the fire just after dawn. Caleb had checked the arch the day before and signed his initials on the inspection card, nothing more. Ruthie arrived with empty jars. May came with a clipboard and 2 paper bags of rolls for whoever had the longest shift. Grant showed up with a cord of split wood in the bed of his truck and did not make a speech about it. Owen arrived later alone. He stood outside the south door for a while before coming in. Mara did not go to meet him. That would have made it easier for both of them. He looked at the steam, the labels, the buckets, the repaired sill, and the little shelf where Elspeth's ledger rested in its box. "You really kept it," he said. "Yes." He nodded once. Dad was wrong to leave it like he did. Mara kept her hands on the skimmer handle. He was wrong about some things. That's not a denial. No, Owen accepted that. It was the best version of an apology she had ever gotten from him. By noon, the first syrup jars were lined in a row on the bench, each one warm enough to fog the glass slightly. May printed simple labels: Food Fund, Caldwell Boyle, Briar Notch School Kitchen. No banners, no press, just an ordinary handoff from work to use. Ruthie carried the first crate to the truck that would deliver to the school and stopped at the door to look back once. Mara glanced at the rebuilt arch, at the black pan, at the bright steam, making a thin path through the cupola. "I'm working." Later, after the sun dropped and the boil quieted, Mara opened the Sugarhouse ledger only long enough to add a new page. She wrote the date, the number of gallons, the names of the people who helped, and one line at the bottom. Outside the maples stood bare and waiting for leaf. The creek ran dark under the bank. The lower lane held firm. The Sugarhouse, once called a ruin, breathed steam into the evening like it had remembered how. Mara locked the door, turned out the lamp, and left one window unlatched for the night air.